Alright you guys, it's time for lesson 3 of our French beaded zinnia. We're going to be making the calyx today, and we're going to be learning a new technique, the continuous wraparound loops. Now, as the name suggests, this is a continuous technique, so all of these little loops are made all on one wire. And also, as you might have inferred from the name, this is another evolution of the continuous loop technique. However, this time, we're going to have a starting loop in the middle, and then we're going to wrap another row of beads around it. Now, if you're working with a pattern that uses an abbreviation, CWL stands for continuous wraparound loops. Now, the pattern for our Zinnia calyx, we're going to be making 10 two-row continuous wraparound loops, and we're going to be alternating between sizes. We have a 9-bead starting loop and a 5-bead starting loop. So we've got a larger size loop and a smaller size loop. And I know it looks like 2 layers, but it is all made on one single length of wire. Now there's something else that's a little bit different about this particular component in our French beaded zinnia. We're going to be working with 2 different colors of beads to create what is called a shading pattern. We've got the lighter green in the center, and then we're going to be edging that loop with a darker green. Now in French beading, when you're working with any technique other than continuous loops, and you've got 2 or more different colors of beads, then we do not pre-string our beads onto the spool and work from the spool. Now, in order to pre-string beads, we need to have a bead count or a measurement. However, when we add in these extra rows, we get into a situation where you might have a different number of beads than the designer. Now, firstly, this happens if you're using a different bead than the designer. French beading patterns are supposed to work with any brand of size 11 seed beads, but they aren't all the same size stringing direction. And even within the same brand, there are different size, the sizes aren't all 100% consistent. So even if the designer uses 16 beads in that outer row, you might need 17 or 15 or 18, just based on the beads that you're using. But then you also throw in this idea that personal technique can also affect how many beads are in each row. Our hands all work a little bit differently. We all twist a little bit differently. Our angles are all just slightly different than the other. So that can also affect how many beads are in each row. Now, if you have a pattern that gives you a bead count for a shading pattern, then I will recommend that you treat those as a guideline instead of a rule. It is safer when we're working with 2 different colors of beads to cut wire off of the spool and then string beads as needed, rather than pre-string and have the beads maybe not line up right. Alright, let's go look at how to make this. Alright, now if you've only got 1 bead spinner, then put the darker green in the bead spinner, because we're going to be stringing more of that bead at a time than the lighter green. So I've got my lighter green bead in a cup, and we're going to use the scooping method for that one. Alright, now we're going to cut about 2 feet of wire. You can use either 26 or 24 gauge for this. Now, when a French beading pattern gives you a specific length of wire to cut off of the spool, cut a little bit extra. Just like we might use different number of beads, we might use a slightly different length of wire as well. So cut a little bit extra, at least the first time you do it, to try and figure out how much wire you need to use. Alright. Now our first loop is going to have a 9-bead starting loop, and we're going to do that in the light green. So I'm going to stab until I've got 9 beads on my wire. And this is a continuous technique, so we need to leave that 2 to 3 inch tail wire right at the beginning. Alright, so I'm going to pinch and hold there. And then I'm going to fold those beads in half. We're going to make these into a loop by twisting one twice. Alright, you only need to do 1 full rotation below the starting loop of a wraparound loop. Now we're also going to pinch, I don't know if you saw me do that, I pinched my loop closed because I don't really want a hole in the middle of my loop. Now one little note here, I twist my loops, when I'm twisting those wires below, I twist clockwise. And that means that my working wire is going to fold over the front of this bottom wire. It's going to come over the front pointing in this direction. Let me show you why that matters. Let me get some of these beads on here. I'm going to string about 1 inch of these darker green beads. All right, now when the working wire is coming over the front of that bottom wire, I can slide my beads down and cover that bottom wire completely. However, if I were to switch it so that my wire is going around the back, then I can't get those beads all the way down on top of the bottom of that, the bottom wire. And I can't cover it. And that means I'm going to have a little bit of wire exposed in my finished loop. Now you can twist the opposite direction if you want to. If it is more comfortable for you to twist your loop counterclockwise, then your working wire is going to fold over the front of this bottom wire going this direction, and then you're going to wrap your loops, the second row of your loops this way. Now, I'm going to go this way, but you can go the opposite direction if it's more comfortable for you to twist the opposite way. All right, so I've got about an inch of these dark green beads on there, and I'm going to push them all the way down against that bottom wire, and I'm going to hold tension on those beads. I don't want any gaps to form in this row. And then I'm going to grab that starting loop with my thumb and forefinger so it's flat between my fingers. And then I'm going to rotate that loop into that new row of beads. And that's going to help me form that extra row nice and tight around my starting loop. Now you can, if you don't want to hold your petal that way, or if you can't hold your petal that way, you can kind of loop it around like this. However, you need to pay attention, because what I've got here is I've got my loops buckling up on top of each other. They're not sitting flat side by side. So you're going to need to make sure that they are flat side by side and that they are pressed as closely together as you can. So I'm going to measure the beads that I need to reach that bottom wire. And I'm going to wrap around twice. And that finishes off that first loop. I've got these extra beads on my wire, so I'm going to remove those and put them back in my spinner. All right, now we're switching to a 5 bead starting loop because we're going to alternate the sizes. So I need 5 of the lighter green and somewhere around an inch of the darker green. And I'm going to slide those all the way down. Now we've got to leave a space here. We need just enough space to make the wraps below the starting loop. Can I get any closer here? I can. All right. We need just enough space to be able to make those wraps below the starting loop. Now with this particular piece, we don't want a lot of space left over between. With normal wraparound loops, you would have that same amount of spacing as you do with continuous loops or crossover loops. For this particular component, we want to try to get them a little tiny bit closer together. All right, so I'm going to hold, you can tell how much space you need by kind of measuring between the bottom of your starting loop and the bottom of your petal and the first one. So that's going to tell you how much space you need to make those wraps. You can do that visually, or you can use a ruler if you need to. So I'm going to fold those 5 beads into a starting loop and twist them twice. And I'm going to push those dark green beads down all the way against that starting loop. And I want to make sure that my wire is straight below. And then I'm going to grab the starting loop and pinch it between my thumb and forefinger. And I'm going to wrap around while I rotate my loop. Now the reason why I pinched it, that allows me to have, when I pinch it like this, I create kind of a little channel with my fingers that new row of beads can fit right into. And I can tug pretty hard on that so I can make sure that my row is nice and tight and it won't upset the loop in the center or make the rows bunch on top of each other. And that's why I pinch and hold. Then we're going to measure the beads we need to reach the bottom wire. And then we're going to wrap one twice. And I've got excess beads, so I'm going to take those off, put them back in my spinner. And I'm going to fold my smaller loop so it is in front of the larger loop. All right, so now we're going to switch back to the 9 bead loop. So 9 of the lighter green, and then somewhere around an inch of the darker green. And we're going to leave that space again. We just need a little bit of space, just enough to make those wraps and tie off. I'm going to pinch and hold that wire space so it doesn't shrink or grow. Fold, twist 2, pinch those beads together to get rid of the gap between. Bring the darker green beads down and push them all the way to the bottom. Grab the starting loop, rotate, measure the beads we need to reach the bottom, and wrap once and twice. Remove the excess beads and put them back in the spinner. Now I've got a larger loop and I want that in the back, so I'm going to tuck that behind the smaller loop. All right, now we're going to switch back to a 5 bead loop. All right, so I've got my 5 lighter green beads. I'm going to leave a tiny little space in the wire. Hold it, fold it, twist 2, bring the darker beads down, grab, rotate, measure, and wrap once, twice. It's a smaller one, so I'm going to push that into the front, in front of the larger loops. Now, one thing I want to point out here is that there is a front and a back to these loops. With our crossovers and our continuous loops, there wasn't a well-defined front or back, but for these ones, there are. Let me get a little bit closer so I can show you. Okay. Now, as you can see, I'm looking at the back of these loops right here, and there's a lot more wire exposed on the back side. That's where we did our wraps for each of the rows. Now, if you look at the front, there is not as much exposed wire there. That's how you're going to be able to tell the difference, is by the amount of exposed wire. Now, each of these loops, when you're making them, should be facing front towards you, with the back away from you. All right, so you're going to continue making those loops until you have 10 of them total. And they should be layered so that the smaller ones are on front and the larger ones are on the back. Now make sure that you've identified which is the back side of the loops and which side is the front side, because we want our calyx to go like this. We want the underside, the back side of these loops, to face underneath the bottom of the flower and not down. We don't want it upside down like this on our flower. We want these larger ones to be closest to the flower, with the undersides facing up towards the bottom of the flower. All right, so flip it so that you're looking at the back side of your unit. You should be looking at the larger loops. And we're going to take that one of the wires, it doesn't really matter which one, and we're going to loop it around the first loop on the other side. Make sure that your layering remains correct with the larger ones on the back and the smaller ones in the front. So we're going to loop once around the first loop, and then we're going to bring these wires to what would have been the top side if we were doing a normal unit. So we're going to bring both of those wires down, and we are not going to center them. Now, by the time we get to this unit with assembly, our stem wire for our flower is going to be a little bit thicker. It's going to be somewhere around this size. It should be pretty dang close to that size. So we are not going to center our wire, because at that point the wire can sit right beside the stem wire and it'll be perfectly fine. If we were to center it, it would actually get in the way of the flower stem. So for this unit, you do not need to center. Instead, we're going to leave them off to the side, and then we're going to twist them together. And try to make your twists nice and smooth. And that means that you're going to open it up at a V where the wires are the same angle away from the twisted stem. and then apply even pressure on each of those wires, and you should get a nice smooth twist. All right, and again, you want to make sure that the ends are trimmed to a different length. All right, so there is the calyx, and you're going to need to make one of these for each of the flowers.